Hi, this is Jeff from the Ozark Mountains in Missouri, USA. Today, we're taking a look at a really interesting little laptop computer, the Olivetti M-10. But we've already seen something very similar to this on a past episode, which is the Tandy Radio Shack T102. Now, these were both designed by Kyocera back in the 1980s. This one for Tandy, and this one for Olivetti, but they are very similar, even though they look a little bit different on the outside. And the M10 has a superpower. The screen actually tilts up like a modern laptop. How about that? Someone sent this M10 in to have the memory battery replaced, which is always a good idea on these types of computers. And I thought it was a good opportunity to kind of have a look-see and compare these two computers and see how they're similar and see how they differ, other than the fancy flip-up screen. Anyhow, let's jump right in and get started. Here are just a few of the circuit boards I've had made recently by PCBWay, who is nice enough to sponsor this video. So whether you need a few boards or a lot of boards, check out PCBWay. Jump on over to the PCBWay website and get your instant quote on standard circuit boards, advanced, flex. They even do assembly, and you can get stencils made. For your next project, check out PCBWay. Looking at our two units side by side, we can see that the keyboards are very similar but slightly different. They definitely have the same design language, the same indentations on the side, but for instance, we have a caps lock key here, where we have a shift here, and instead of a control key here, we have the caps lock. Got a couple buttons to the left of the space bar here, but only one here, etc. Just several little differences like that. Our top row keys here, all the function keys, and the cursor keys, those are all the same, however. And of course, the big difference, which I've mentioned a few times already, is the flip-up screen on the Olivetti. So I've stacked the two computers up here so it's easier to get a side-by-side view, or top and bottom view, I guess in this case, with a little bit of bubbly wrap in between them. And you can see from the back here that things look pretty similar. We have an RS-232 port, a printer port, phone and cassette port, but we've got the BCR port here on the back on the Olivetti, whereas it's over here on the side on the Tandy. And in a similar fashion, we've got the reset here that's here on the Olivetti, the power connections here on the Olivetti, where it's on this side on the Tandy. It's like they tried to make the exterior appearance of this Olivetti M10 a little slicker. Now, one other note about this screen is you can just see here, there's a magnet and there's a little plate up here. You can hear that snap down. And you thought all the magnets snapping things into place was a modern thing. Here we go, from the early to mid 1980s. And if we take a look at the left-hand side here, you can see on the Olivetti we have nothing. On the Tandy we have the BCR port and a couple switches for the modem. On the Olivetti, these switches are here on the bottom. On the right hand side, both have a contrast knob here and here where it's easily accessible. The on-off switch for the Tandy is here, whereas it's under here for the Olivetti. And of course our 6-volt jack, which is here on the Tandy, is on the back of the Olivetti here. Now on the bottoms of our two computers, we have our battery compartments in a similar area. On the Olivetti, we have the modem switches, which are on the side of the Tandy over here. On the Tandy, we had access to the system bus from the back here. But on the Olivetti, it's under this nifty little flap here, which they even put a latch here to hold the cover down. That's a nice touch. On the Tandy, we have the memory battery switch here, whereas it is here on the Olivetti, and our power switch, which is on this side of the Tandy, is here for the Olivetti. This compartment and this compartment are both external access to the option ROM/option RAM areas. Now, even though Olivetti is an Italian brand, we should note that this was made in Japan for Olivetti, and this Tandy-102 here was actually originally shipped into the Canadian market, which is kind of interesting. This was made for Tandy of Canada. What do you say we get inside these things and compare the innards? The 102 would normally have 4 screws in the corner here, which are missing from this one because I got this one as a parts machine, and it mostly works. This is the one we worked on the LCD screen for, which still has a line in it. And to pop the covers loose on these guys, just need a spudger tool. Get down the center like that, and there's a catch on each side. Just like that. And whereas the Model 100, this top cover peels off like so with the keyboard attached, on the 102, it's a separate piece. On the Olivetti, we also have a screw in each corner. I did not see a screw in the battery compartment or the option ROM compartment. And I have not found a service manual for these guys yet. So I'm just going under the assumption that it is very similar to the 102. Okay, I would guess that this guy's going to pop open in a similar manner. I'm not sure what's going to happen with the screen. Yep, there's a catch there. Oh, I popped it back together. There's a latch right there in the middle. You can feel it with the spudger tool. And I don't feel anything on the right side or the left side, so maybe there's something on the back. And, oh, there we go. We just need to hold our mouth just right. Okay, lift this up slowly. Ah, on this one, the bottom comes off as a unit. So here's our 2 units side by side with the first cover taken off. And you can see the Olivetti is, well, it's built upside down. The 102 is kind of like that too. But with the 102, we took this top cover off and we have access to the screen and the keyboard. On the Olivetti, the bottom comes off. And we've got our memory battery over here. This is what we'll be changing. And I see a little crustiness around the cap here, which we'll have to look at. That could be from the battery. And we'll inspect all of these caps really closely. On the 102, normally the capacitors are fine. By the time they got to this era, these miniature electrolytics were a lot better than they were, say, on the Model 100 era. And the RAMs look very similar. We've got the option RAMs here, our 8155 parallel port, the processor, serial chip, some glue logic. So kind of the same thing basically in a little different places than on the 102. So on the 102 here, we can lift up the keyboard and just unplug him. Get him the same thing with the LCD. Thread our LCD cable out, and here we can see the back of our 102 board, and we've got a bunch of glue logic on the back here. The big difference between the Model 100 and the 102 is they did mostly surface mount stuff, or 50% surface mount stuff for the 102. And it looks like on the Olivetti we have a couple ribbon cables here on this side. So if we tip up with the 102 board, it'll come like this. We can take it out and see we have our keyboard cable here and the LCD cable there. And on our Olivetti, we've got a couple cables here. Always have to be careful with these ribbon cables. to not try to bend them too much. They're old and fragile. And it looks like we've got a couple 3 screws here to worry about. So I think if we tilt that up, we can sneak it out of there, and then we're going to have to worry about dislodging this LCD ribbon. This uses a normal ribbon cable, not this flat flex stuff. So we'll sneak him off of there like that. We can poke him down through that hole. Well, that's a really convenient way to do that. Oh, yeah. We have our base unit. So the keyboard is hiding under here. This uses 2 ribbon cables, which are more similar to the Model 100, whereas the 102 has a finer pitched cable. So here we have our 2 circuit boards side by side. You know, the 102 is a very slick design. It's a very nice layout. It's very compact. They made extensive use of surface mount chips. They've got chips mounted on the back side of the board, or a double-sided load. And the Olivetti M-10 is more of a traditional build for that time frame, being all through hole. Although functionality-wise and in other aspects, more like the 102. So it has the piezo buzzer mounted on the back, whereas the 102 does not. It has all the glue logic ICs. But the 102 still has some thick wires running around the board. And we've got a diode kind of bodged in here. On the 102, this is where that memory battery would be. It's already been pulled off of here. Whereas it's over here on the M10. I think it's safe to say that, yes, these were both built with very similar ideas in mind. You know, you can definitely see the heritage between these two. It kind of makes me wonder if the M10 design was a midpoint between the 100 and the 102. Given that, you know, the 102 has made extensive use of surface mount technology, the board's much smaller. The M10 has the metal can sealed telco relays in both locations here, whereas the 102 got by with just one, and one of a more normal relay, which must have been a cost savings thing. And this clear capped relay back here is the cassette remote. Okay, well, now we've seen what the differences are between them and what the similarities are. We'll get to the main subject of the point of taking this M10 apart, which is this memory battery. And we're going to need to look at these capacitors really closely to see if they follow with the 102 of not being an issue, or closer to the 100 of being an issue and leaking. Well, bad news for us. As you can see here, we definitely have some crusty capacitors, and they look like the same usual suspects from the Model 100. So I guess this particular machine is more of a stopping point between the Model 100 and the 102. And they've used more of the Model 100 style capacitors. Several of these 10 microfarad sized caps are leaking, which are the ones that always leak on the Model 100. You can just see the crustiness right there too. So I will have to make a capacitor map of this board and check all the values, and hopefully I have these on hand so we can go ahead and recap this at the same time we do the memory battery, and it'll be all set. Well, you guys have seen me do this many times, extracting and installing new caps. I'm going to start with these 4 little 10 microfarad jobbies right here. These are always some of the worst leakers on these boards. And you know how this goes. I will use my little fiberglass scratching tool pin here. This one's much better than the cheap style. But we'll scratch the pads in the back of the board to get rid of that kind of crystallization. We'll apply a little flux, a little new solder to work that loose, and then we'll walk the caps out. I made up a new capacitor map for this board, and luckily it uses the same capacitor set as the Model 100, the Model 102, even all the same component numbers on the board. They're just in different locations everywhere. So this shouldn't be a big deal. Let's jump in and get these 4 little buggers out of here. On an unfamiliar board, one of the hardest things to do is try to figure out where the stuff is you want to work on. Fortunate thing with these boards is there are only 2 layers, so you can hold them up to the light and kind of see through. And I've made a mess with my markings on here, but these 2 should be one cap, these 2 should be another, these 2, and these 2. By this point, I had already scratched the pads with a fiberglass pin, and now I'm going to apply a little flux, and then I will hit each joint with some fresh solder to help make the desoldering easier. I'm sorry everything's out of frame here. That's just how it goes sometimes. So we will heat the top leg on one of these. Push the cap down, heat the bottom leg, pull the cap that way. There we go. Now we got that cap out of there. There we go. Now we got those 2 little buggers out of there. And of course we'll use the solder sucker to clean those holes out. And we'll do the same thing on the other capacitors up there. So we've got our incontinent capacitors removed. And one thing we'll notice on the top is there is a little bit of corrosion on these pads. So we'll want to take our fiberglass pin and scratch that off of there. These really aren't too bad. Just kind of like that. I'll clean that off of there with some alcohol. Then we'll add a little flux, tin these with some solder, suck the solder back out of there, and they should be good to go. The point of adding more flux and solder is that the flux will, mixed with any junk that is still left over, and it will also tin the pads and protect them. And we know that if the solder is sticking to the pads, then we've got them nice and clean. Yeah, so 3 of these, the solder is stuck fine to. This one's really not working too well. So we'll suck out what we've put in there so far. Clean the flux residue off of there. Hit it with our fiberglass pin again. And sometimes you have to do this a few times. There we go. I can kind of see a copper color to that one now. Yeah, now that's tinning up nicely. Okay. Now we can get the solder sucked out of these holes and pop some new caps in there. The worst of the damage was here around C82 near the battery holder, but it wasn't too bad. That was cleaned up, tinned, and then I'll overcoat it with this nifty CircuitWorks overcoating pen. I really like this thing. It does a good job. Then I'll let it set overnight for the coating to cure. Well, it's the next morning, so we're ready to install some new capacitors in this board. I have my capacitor map. And luckily I just got in some capacitors, so we'll proceed to popping some of these guys in here. I think we'll start with the 4 10 microfarad caps, which go up in this area. It seems like on this board they used the same capacitors as the Model 100 and such, but the lead spacing is a little bigger. So what I like to do in that case is just give them a tweak like this. Sometimes you'll get new capacitors in that are already tweaked out like that because that's the closest you can get to the original. So it's no problem to fix them. There we go, that fits better. Then we can just splay these legs out a little like that, keep it in place, and we'll do the other three. And of course these are polarized, so we gotta get them in the right orientation. Now there are 4 capacitors on this board that are non-polarized electrolytics, so it doesn't matter which way you put them in there. I had the thought last evening of a way to improve the capacitor maps to better indicate the orientation of the capacitor, so probably by the time this video comes out I'll have this particular map updated and it'll be a little easier to read, hopefully. Okay, now I like to double check that I've got all of these in the right orientation. I don't want disoriented capacitors. And we'll flip it over and solder these guys in. So I've got the iron warmed up and I tinned the tip already. So just like normal, I'll do one leg and I'll reach under the board, push up on it, and reflow that. That just keeps the capacitor, oops, I'm missing that one. It just makes sure that it's seated like it should be, so it'll look nice and neat. We don't want messy looking capacitors, do we? Well, these ones with thicker traces, we want to keep our iron on there long enough to heat everything up. Soldering is not a race. There we go. Well, I've got some sharp little clippers here. C52, 50 volt, 1 microfarad, which is that non-polarized one I was talking about. So this capacitor, as you can see, has no polarity stripe on it because it is not polarized. And pop him in there any old way. Got my finger on the cap under the board. We'll reflow that one to make sure the cap is seated. There we go. Trim those leads. And that's all there is to it. And then when we're done at the end, we'll come back and clean up all the flux off the board. So we have all our capacitors installed, and I double checked against the list and the board to make sure I had the right capacitor in the right spot and in the right orientation. I installed the battery holder here, but I have not soldered the leads on yet, and we need to install the battery, which I have right here. It has positive and negative written here, and we have a negative here on our board. I'm going to turn off the backup battery switch there. Pop that guy down. These do not always go in well. And I tried to straighten up the legs on the battery. Okay, this side is going in nice and easy. So we'll try to heat up that hole and push it through. I don't think that helped. Well, actually, that may have done it. It can also be difficult to get the batteries out at times because of the same problem. The pins are just a little too big for the holes they used. There we go. And these batteries will soak up a lot of heat, so we want to keep our soldering iron on these terminals for several seconds to make sure we're getting things hot enough to flow the solder through. Now the next step in our process is to clean up the mess we made. Soldering new stuff onto the board. For instance, right here was one capacitor, and they did some hand soldering from the factory right there, so I will give it a scrub with the toothbrush. Now if I just left it like this, all I've done is smear stuff all over the board. But I can do this and soak all that nasty stuff right up into the rag. So I'll just do that on the rest of the board, clean it all up, and then we'll test it out. I was guessing that since this board was so much like the Model 100 and 102, that we could go ahead and use the test harness for those. And indeed, even the chip numbers are the same. So I needed to hook the not right line up to chip M20 pin 7, just like on the Model 100. And this uses a standard format ROM socket. It's like a 27C256, like the later Model 100s and the 102. So all that's fine, and I can run the basic tests with just the ROM board. At this point, I thought I could only use the ROM board because the system bus connector was different. But it turns out I was wrong. Let me explain. Well, after spending about 30 minutes tracing out all the signals from the system bus connector on this M10, I realized it indeed is like the Model 100 and 102. First came the Model 100, which had a dip socket for the system bus connector, and they intended that you use a cable like this, which has a 40-pin dip socket at one end and a female 2-row header at the other end. And of course, if you go from, on this dip socket with this ribbon cable in here, the ribbon goes, pin 1, pin 40, pin 2, pin 39, etc. So when you get to this other end of this cable like so, you have a really strange pin out. It goes pin 1, pin 40, pin 2, pin 39, etc. rather than the normal 1, 2, 3, 1, 3, 5, odd on the top, even on the bottom, which is rather confusing. Now, when they came out with the Model 102, they did away with this whole silly dip socket arrangement, and they just put this sort of connector right on the back of the machine, which was a lot more convenient. And I really, I made up this cable, and I had a lot of problems getting a good crimp on this dip socket, and I don't like these in general. So I made a little adapter board like this, which plugs into that dip socket, and it just gives you a male IDC. And then you just need a female to female IDC cable to plug into the connection board on the test harness, which is what this is. And conveniently, this M10, the system bus connector, is basically this. Unbeknownst to me, I happened to create this, so it worked exactly like the M10 connector here. So this ribbon cable plugs right into the connection board, and the whole harness just works. How about that? So luckily I was wrong. The test harness works. This all tests out fine. Can't use the LCD loopback because there's not enough room here to plug it in, so it would create like a little 6-inch or so long cable to plug that into. And of course the keyboard connectors are completely different. It uses two 9-pin flat flex cables. Right now there's no loopback for these either, but we can plug the keyboard in when we reassemble this and test everything out. So I've run the test harness on this a few times. Everything tests out fine. So we'll just go ahead and get it popped back together and do some typing on it, try it out. And of course, assembly is the opposite of disassembly. I want to point out here, this is the second time I've actually put this back together because the first time I forgot the ROM. And also, watch out for C92. If it's bent toward the battery holder, it may interfere with the cover. Well, we've got it all back together now, and it did work much better once I actually put the ROM back inside it. Silly me. And, of course, I've tried the requisite basic program, which works great. And I even typed in a bestseller text document. There you go. The keyboard works great. Being able to adjust the angle of the screen is actually a big help. Even for filming, I was able to keep this at a comfortable level to use and adjust the screen up to where I got no glare off of it. And I can see it well, and you can see it well in the camera. And there's still quite a bit of range with the contrast knob here for adjusting it. The switches that are on the bottom here are easy to get to. You kind of have to remember what you're after there. But I find this to be a very nicely designed machine, and it works great. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this look at the Olivetti M-10 and comparing it to the Tandy-102. At the onset of this, I thought that the M10 and the 102 were both adaptations of the Model 100, but it seems like to me now that the M10 was kind of a stepping stone along the way between the Model 100 and the 102. The M10 is definitely an interesting machine. The tilting screen is awesome, and the fact that the layout, the chip numbers, the part designations on the board are all the same as the 100 and 102, uses the same set of capacitors. That's really handy. We're even able to use the test harness. I'd like to say thanks to the fellow that sent this in for me to work on. That was a lot of fun. I would like to take a moment and say thanks to everyone who helps support the Hey Birt channel through Patreon and other means. Your help keeps this channel going, and if you would like to find out some more information about becoming a supporting member, just look in the description down below. If you're a subscriber, thank you. I appreciate it very much. If you're not, well, it's not too hard. Just look down below. You'll see a rectangular button and it says subscribe. Well, click on that, dude, and you'll be subscribed to the channel. Then, if you click on that little bell-shaped icon, YouTube will be nice enough to let you know just as soon as I post a new video. If you have any questions or comments, well, I would love to hear from you. Just leave them in the comment section down below. Well, until next time, bye.